The blizzard came without mercy. It did not announce itself with a gradual chill or a slow darkening of the sky. It arrived the way disaster always arrives on the Montana frontier, fast, absolute, and indifferent to everything human beings had built or believed or hoped for. 1 hour there was wind. The next hour there was nothing but white. The kind of white that swallowed sound, swallowed distance, swallowed the difference between ground and sky until a man could not tell which direction led home and which led to his grave. Chet Dolan had been trapping along the creek beds north of Judith Basin for 11 days when the storm caught him. He was not a careless man. He had spent 17 years reading weather off the mountains, and he had been wrong before, but never this wrong. By the time the temperature dropped to 40 below, he had already lost 2 fingers to frostbite in a previous winter, and he was not interested in losing more. He pushed south through the white nothing, following a creek line he could barely see until he remembered something. 3 miles north of the settlement, a stone hut. He had ridden past it the previous autumn and thought little of it. It looked like a root cellar somebody had given up on. Low walls, heavy roof, no windows worth mentioning. The kind of structure a desperate person builds when they have run out of better ideas. He had thought nothing more of it. But now, with the wind at 40 below and his hands going numb inside his gloves, he turned north instead of south and aimed himself at that ugly little building like it was the last solid thing left in the world. He almost missed it. The snow had buried the lower walls to the eaves. Only the chimney told him where to look, a single thin thread of smoke rising and then torn sideways by the wind. He fought his way to the door and pounded with his fist. It opened almost immediately. Warm air rolled out into the storm like something alive. Not hot, not the sharp, dry heat of a fire burning hard to fight the cold. Just warmth. Steady, even warmth, the kind that does not announce itself but simply is. The kind a man feels in his chest before he feels it on his skin. A woman stood in the doorway, 34 years old, dark eyes, calm in a way that had nothing to do with youth or inexperience. It was the calm of someone who had already made every important decision and was simply living inside those decisions now. She stepped back without a word and let him in. Dolan stood inside the stone hut and did not speak for a long moment. He pulled off his gloves. He turned his hands over slowly like a man checking for damage. Then he looked up at the walls. He reached out and pressed one palm flat against the stone. It was warm. Not from the fire had burned down to coals, a small, unhurried pile of orange light in the firebox against the west wall. The stone itself was warm, like something living, like something that had absorbed 10,000 hours of heat and was giving it back at its own pace, patient and steady and entirely indifferent to the storm outside. Dolan looked at the woman. She was watching him with those calm, dark eyes, waiting to see what he would say. He did not say anything. He simply sat down near the fire and let the warmth find him. In the loft above, he could hear children sleeping, not restless, not crying, just sleeping the way children sleep when they are truly comfortable, deep and quiet and complete. Outside, the wind threw itself against the stone walls and found no purchase. 8 months earlier, on a morning in March, when the last of the winter snow was pulling back from the hillsides like a reluctant guest, Constance Hale had stood at the door of her log cabin and made a decision. The cabin her husband Nathaniel had built was standard Montana work. Pine logs stacked and chinked with mud and dry moss. A single stone chimney that leaked smoke when the wind came from the northwest. A dirt floor covered with rough planks that warped and separated every spring. It was the kind of cabin that worked barely, the kind that asked everything of the people living inside it and gave back just enough to keep them alive. Nathaniel had been proud of it. He had built it the same way his father built, the same way every man on the frontier built. There was comfort in that sameness. There was dignity in continuing the tradition. Constance had lived in it for 6 years and fought the cold every single winter. She knew every draft by the sound it made. She knew which corner froze first and which wall held heat the longest. She knew exactly how many cords of wood a Montana winter consumed and she knew what it felt like to watch that pile shrink toward nothing while February showed no sign of ending. By that March morning, she had been a widow for 3 years. Nathaniel had died in the winter of 1880. The details were simple and terrible in the way that frontier deaths always are. He had been hauling freight across the Judith River when the ice gave way beneath the wagon. The horses, the load, the man. All of it gone through the black water in less than a minute. What very few people knew, what Constance had never told anyone, not even her sister in Colorado, was that she had seen the ice that morning. She had walked to the river's edge while Nathaniel was loading the wagon. She had looked at the surface. She had seen the color of it, that particular gray-green shade that old-timers knew meant weak ice that had thawed and refrozen unevenly ice that held its shape but not its strength. She had seen it and she had understood what she was seeing, and she had said nothing. Not because she did not care, because she had learned through 6 years of marriage and many years before that when a woman says stop, the wagon keeps moving. She had offered opinions before about which route to take, about which field to plant first, about whether the roof needed attention before the first snow. She had been right most of those times. The opinions had been received the way winter wind is received, noted, endured, and forgotten. So that morning she had looked at the ice and she had not spoken. She had watched him climb onto the wagon seat. She had watched him slap the reins. She had watched the horses move forward onto the river. She had stood on the bank and watched until the ice took everything, and then she had turned and walked back to the cabin because there was nothing else to do. 3 years had passed. She had kept the homestead claim. She had raised her son Wallace, who was now 9, and her daughter Ruth, who was 7. She had kept the fire burning and the children fed and the roof from collapsing under the weight of snow. She had done all of this with no explanation and no complaint because the frontier did not have much patience for either one. But that March morning in 1883, standing at the door of the log cabin and looking at the muddy hillside behind her claim, she made a decision born not from grief or anger, but from something colder and more useful. She was done fighting the cold the way Nathaniel had fought it, the way every man on the frontier fought it, with more wood, more effort, more force. She was going to try something different, something she had not thought about in years, something buried under all the ordinary weight of ordinary life. She was going to remember what her father had taught her, and this time she was not going to stay silent. Her father's name was Edmund Calloway. He had come from Cornwall, England, as a young man, the youngest son of a family that had worked stone for 3 generations. Not decorative stone, working stone. Foundations and root cellars and walls that were meant to do something, walls meant to last when everything else gave way. He had come to southern Colorado with his tools and his knowledge and his accent that made people laugh, and his absolute certainty about the properties of dense rock under pressure and cold. He had built things in Colorado that looked strange to American eyes. Low, thick, buried into hillsides where the earth could do half the work for free. He mortared with clay and river sand. He fitted stones the way a careful man fits an argument, each piece chosen for where it sat and what it held. The people of his community had tolerated him the way communities tolerate the genuinely different, with a kind of bemused distance that never quite became acceptance. He was useful when a foundation needed laying. He was strange the rest of the time. His house looked like something from another century in another country, and the neighbors said so freely and without cruelty, the way people say things that are true and small. He had died when Constance was 19. Not from anything dramatic, just the wearing down of a man who worked hard in all weather for many years and one winter could not get warm again. He had died in the stone house he built in a room that stayed 68 degrees, even when the Colorado wind came howling off the Rockies, and perhaps there was a particular dignity in that, though Constance had been too young and too grief-stricken to notice it then. What she remembered now, 34 years old and standing in the mud of a Montana spring, was not the grief. It was the lessons. Her father had talked about stone the way some men talk about God, not with religious fervor, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has seen the evidence and no longer needs to argue about it. He talked about mass, about how mass absorbs heat and releases it slowly the way a river holds the summer's warmth into October. He talked about thickness, about burial, about how the ground itself never freezes more than a few feet down, no matter how cold the surface gets. He talked about the difference between fighting cold and ignoring it. Fighting cold, he said, was what you did when you built thin walls and big fires. You were always fighting. You burned everything you had and still lost ground by morning. Ignoring cold was different. Ignoring cold meant building something so thick and so heavy that the cold simply could not find its way through before the stone had already warmed the space from inside. It meant using the earth the way the earth uses itself. It meant patience. It meant thinking about January and May when the sun was warm and the mosquitoes were bad and winter seemed like something that happened to other people. Constance had been 12 years old when she understood that her father was not eccentric. He was simply operating on a longer timeline than everyone around him. She had never forgotten that. She began gathering stone in May of 1883. Sandstone from the ridge east of her claim, river rock from the creek bed, limestone from an old buffalo wallow she had noticed 2 years earlier but never had reason to visit. She built a rough sled from pine planks and pulled it herself when the children were at school sometimes. With Wallace's help on weekends, the boy serious and focused in the way that the sons of widows often are, carrying more than his years should require. The neighbors saw her working. Judith Basin was not a large community. People noticed things. Burl Greer noticed first. Greer was a cattleman somewhere past 60, with a face that looked like it had been left out in the weather for 30 years, which it had. He ran the largest operation in the basin and carried the particular authority of a man who had been right about enough things over enough years that being wrong had become genuinely foreign to him. He rode past her claim one afternoon in early June and pulled his horse to a stop and watched her drag the sled up from the creek. He called across the fence, asked what she was building. Constance straightened up, looked at him, said she was building a winter place. Greer looked at the pile of stone near the flat ground at the base of the hill. He looked at the sled. He looked at Constance. He said it looked like a lot of work for a root cellar. She said it was not a root cellar. He rode on without another word, but she could see even from a distance the particular set of his shoulders that meant a man had already made up his mind about something and was only waiting to be proven right. Silas Pembroke came in early July. Pembroke was the best carpenter in Judith Basin, a fact he was aware of and did not hide. He had come from Ohio 15 years earlier with a chest full of good tools and a methodical mind, and he had built more cabins and barns and storefronts in this part of Montana than any other man alive. He was not a cruel person. He was in the particular way of skilled tradesman, someone whose confidence in his expertise made him resistant to any suggestion that there were things his expertise had not covered. He came because he was genuinely concerned. That was the part that made it harder. He was not mocking her. He stood at the base of the rising walls, hat in hand, and he looked at the work with the eyes of a professional. He pointed out that stone held moisture differently than wood. He said that without proper ventilation, condensation would form on the interior walls and run down into the mortar joints, and the mold would follow. He said he had seen stone structures fail in the Montana climate for exactly this reason. He said he was telling her this as a neighbor, not as a critic. Constance listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. When he was finished, she thanked him for his time and said she would keep his concerns in mind. Pembroke left looking slightly puzzled, the way people look when they have prepared for a debate and the other person has declined to have one. What Constance had not said and would not say was that she had already thought through every point he raised. The moisture problem was real. Her father had talked about it. The solution was in the mortar mix, clay and river sand, in the right proportion, mixed thick and pressed deep into the joints, not slapped on, but worked in carefully so it cured solid but not brittle. Stone did breathe, but it breathed slowly, and if the mortar was right, moisture moved through the wall at a rate too slow to puddle or run. Her father had told her this. She had watched him do it. She trusted the knowledge because she had seen the proof standing in Colorado 30 years on without a crack or a wet corner. She also had not said what she understood about Pembroke's concern that had nothing to do with moisture or mold. She had seen it in his eyes before he finished his first sentence. A flicker of something behind the professional worry, something that looked like a man confronting the edges of what he knew. If stone construction work truly worked the way she was building it, then 15 years of pine log cabins suddenly looked not wrong, but incomplete. And a man who has built his reputation on having the answers does not easily welcome the suggestion that the answers have a boundary he has not yet found. She did not blame him for it. She simply noted it and continued working. By August, the walls were chest high. The hut was small, 16 feet by 20, smaller than the log cabin. But Constance had not designed it to impress anyone. She had designed it the way her father designed everything from the inside out, starting with what the space needed to do and working backward to what the walls needed to be. 2 feet thick at the base, slightly narrower at the top. Each stone laid with attention, checked with the weighted string her father had pressed into her hand the summer before he died, an old tool worn smooth by his grip and his father's grip before that. She did not use it because it was sentimental. She used it because it was accurate. The north wall cut 3 feet into the hillside behind her claim. She had dug that foundation by hand over 3 weeks in May and June, moving earth with a mattock and a hand plow, in a stubbornness that her daughter Ruth observed with wide eyes and her son Wallace observed with something closer to reverence. The ground became the wall. The hillside became insulation. She was not building against the land. She was building into it. The firebox went against the west wall, dense river stone chosen for a basalt where she could find it, quartzite where she could not, stone that would not crack under repeated heating and cooling. She built the firebox wider and lower than standard, a shape that spread heat across a broader surface area and drew the warmth into the stone mass of the wall rather than sending it straight up the chimney. The chimney itself was short, just enough draft to pull the smoke out, not so much that it would pull the heat with it. The roof was overlapping pine logs sealed with clay and sod, heavy, low. 7 feet at the peak, inside which was not generous, but was sufficient, and which meant that warm air had nowhere to rise to. Warm air in a log cabin floats to the ceiling and finds the gaps. Warm air in a low-ceiling stone room has no gap to find. 2 windows on the south wall, small, covered with oiled canvas that let in light and kept out wind. No windows on the northeast or west walls. No invitation for the cold to look for weakness. The door was thick pine set deep into a stone frame with a leather gasket her father had taught her make a rolled and oiled strip that compressed when the door closed and left no space for wind. Everything that looked crude from the outside was calculated from the inside. By September, it was done. The community's reaction arrived in stages the way bad weather arrives first, just a shift in the air, then the clouds, then the thing itself. At the settlement store, men gathered in the evenings after work and talked about the news of the basin, the way they always did. Greer mentioned the stone hut one evening in early October, said it looked like something a badger would build, said the widow Hale had clearly lost her sense of proportion, if not her sense entirely. The men around him laughed in that careful way men laugh at things they are not entirely certain are funny, keeping space to change their position later if needed. Pembroke said more seriously that he stood by his concern about moisture. That stone and was not a building material suited to the Montana climate, that he had been building in this territory for 15 years and he had not seen a stone structure survive 2 winters intact. Others nodded. Pembroke's expertise was well established. It was difficult to argue with 15 years of experience, particularly when you were not in the room to argue. Mrs. Eugenia Holt, who taught the 12 children of Judith Basin in a single-room schoolhouse, and who was 31 years old and had opinions about nearly everything said at a church gathering, that she felt sorry for the Hale children growing up in something that dark and small. She said children needed light and space. She said it without malice. She simply could not imagine it being livable, and so she assumed it wasn't. Constance heard most of this secondhand through the particular information network of a small community where very little goes unsaid for long. She received the opinions the way her stone walls received wind. They arrived, they found no purchase, and they moved on. She did not respond. She did not explain. She had learned through a long apprenticeship in being disregarded that explanation is only useful when the other person is ready to receive it. When they are not ready, explanation is simply another word for argument, and argument is simply another word for exhaustion. She was saving her energy for winter. The first snow fell on the 2nd of November, 1883. It was light, a dusting that covered the grass and the fence posts and the roof of the log cabin next door, which she still used for storage and was gone by noon. The kind of snow that reminds you of what is coming without yet showing you the full price. Constance moved the last of her things into the stone hut that morning. The children had already been sleeping there for a week, adjusting to the small space and the lower light, the way children adjust to most things quickly and with considerably less complaint than adults manage. Wallace had discovered that the loft was warm enough to sleep without his heaviest blanket, and had told this to his mother with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of a boy reporting a scientific discovery. Ruth had decided that the south-facing windows, small as they were, caught the afternoon light in a way that was perfect for drawing, which was her primary occupation and the thing she cared most about in the world. Constance laid a fire in the firebox that evening, not a large one, not the kind of fire a log cabin requires to push back a Montana November. A modest, measured fire that caught the seasoned wood quickly and settled into a steady burn. She added 2 pieces, watched the flame find its rhythm, felt the heat begin to move into the stone at her back. She closed the door. Outside, the wind was picking up from the northwest. She could hear it, the particular low moan it made when it came off the mountains, and found nothing between itself and the basin. In the log cabin, that sound had always meant getting up and checking the gaps, stuffing rags and moss into places where the cold was making itself at home. It had meant stoking the fire back to full roar just to keep the room above freezing. Here the sound meant nothing. The wind hit the stone and stopped. She sat in the chair near the firebox and listened to her children sleep in the loft above. The fire settled to coals. The room stayed warm. The stone walls, which had spent the entire summer and fall absorbing Montana sunlight and now held that warmth in their 2-foot thickness, gave it back slowly and without fanfare. Constance sat in the warm room and thought about her father. She thought about the way he had talked about stone, not with the excitement of a man who had discovered something new, but with the patience of a man explaining something ancient and obvious, something that should never have needed explaining at all. She thought about his hands, which were large and rough and permanently grained with rock dust, and how those hands had pressed the weighted string into her palm the summer she turned 19, and he was already moving slowly, already spending more of himself on each day than a day gave back. He had not said much that last summer. He had shown her things instead. How to read the color of stone for density, how to test mortar with your thumbnail after 3 days of curing, how to look at a hillside and see what it offered rather than what it blocked. He had shown her these things the way a man shows a child how to find water in dry country, not as a lesson to be memorized, but as a way of seeing to be inhabited. She had inhabited it. She had carried it through years of marriage and the ordinary demands of frontier life packed away, under everything else the way useful things get packed away. And now she had unpacked it here in this low stone room with its warm walls and its sleeping children and its small fire that was already more coals than flame. Burl Greer, 3 miles south, was adding his 4th log of the evening to a fire that would need attention again before midnight. Constance Hale added nothing. She let the coals breathe. She listened to the wind fail against the stone. and she waited for winter to show exactly what it was made of because she already knew exactly what her walls were made of, and she was not afraid. Outside November moved toward its worst. The mountains held their cold and prepared to release it. The settlement of Judith Basin settled into its familiar annual argument with the season, burning through wood and stuffing gaps, and trusting that effort and fuel could substitute for design. 3 miles north, a woman sat in a warm room and trusted something older than effort. The stone held its heat. The children slept. The wind found nothing. The 19th of November arrived the way a sentence ends, not with warning, but with finality. The morning began ordinary enough. A thin gray light came through the oiled canvas windows of the stone hut and fell across the floor in pale rectangles. Wallace ate his breakfast without speaking, which was his habit. Ruth drew something in the margins of her school primer, which was hers. Constance moved between the firebox and the small table doing the quiet work of morning, the kind of work that has no particular beginning and no particular end, just the steady accumulation of tasks that keeps a household alive. Then the wind changed. Not louder, not immediately harder, just different in quality, the way a river changes sound before a flood. Something deeper in its register, something that the body understands before the mind catches up. Constance stood at the south window and looked out at the sky above the ridge. What she saw was not clouds exactly. It was more like the sky itself was being replaced by something else, something that moved as a single mass, the color of old iron pressing down from the north with the deliberate weight of a door closing. She told Wallace to bring in wood from the lean-to, all of it he could carry. She told Ruth to fill the water bucket from the barrel outside twice before it got worse. The children moved without argument. They had been raised in Montana. They understood what that sky meant. By mid-morning, the snow had started. By noon, the wind had found its full voice. By 3 in the afternoon, Judith Basin had disappeared. There is a particular kind of blizzard that the northern plains produce perhaps once in a decade, a storm that is not merely weather, but something closer to a geological event, a rearrangement of the landscape that leaves everything afterward looking like a different place. This was that kind of storm. The temperature dropped through the afternoon like a stone through water. 20 degrees. 10. 0. The wind drove the snow horizontally, not falling, but traveling, moving across the ground in sheets that erased every familiar shape. Fence posts vanished. The creek disappeared under a surface so uniform it looked like the land had simply decided to become flat. The mountains to the north, which on clear days stood sharp and permanent against the sky, ceased to exist. There was only white and wind, and the sound of both together, a sound with no edges, no beginning, no end. In the log cabins of Judith Basin, fires went from warm to roaring within the first hour. Burl Greer had a good cabin. He had built it 11 years earlier with the kind of attention a man gives to something he intends to keep. Heavy pine logs well fitted, a double-wide hearth of local fieldstone, a wood supply stacked deep under the lean-to that he had started accumulating in August because Greer was not a foolish man and he knew Montana winters. He stoked his fire and settled in with the confidence of someone who has survived this before and expects to again. By evening, the fire was consuming wood at a rate that made him do arithmetic he did not enjoy. The logs were good and dry, and they caught fast and burned hot, which was exactly the problem. Heat rose to the ceiling and found the gaps between the logs at the roofline, gaps he had chinked twice, but that the cold opened again, the way cold always opens things patiently, persistently, without anger. The floor stayed cold no matter how hard the fire burned above it. His wife kept their youngest child near the hearth, wrapped in a wool blanket meant for the horses. The far corner of the bedroom had ice forming on the inside of the wall by nightfall, a thin, translucent skin that grew slowly and would not be pushed back by anything short of moving the fire to the other room, which was not possible. Greer added another log, then another. He told himself the storm would break by morning. Silas Pembroke's cabin was better insulated, a fact he took some quiet pride in. He had built it himself naturally, and he had built it with the knowledge of a professional who understood load-bearing and thermal dynamics in the practical way that carpenters understand such things through materials and methods rather than through theory. His hearth was solid, his log walls were tight. He had banked the exterior with hay bales the previous week when he felt the first real bite in the air. The hay bales helped. He could feel the difference in the corner nearest the banked wall, a slightly lesser chill, a slightly longer interval before the cold crept back after each stoking. His children slept near the fire in shifts, the older ones taking the late hours, so the younger ones could sleep warm in the early night. It was a reasonable system. It had worked before. But by the second night, with the temperature still falling and the wind showing no intention of resting, Pembroke sat by his fire and did sums he had not expected to do. Wood remaining, days the storm might last, rate of consumption against rate of survival. The numbers came out uncomfortable. Not dangerous, not yet, but pointed in a direction he did not like. He told himself the storm would break by morning. In the settlement, 3 families had already abandoned their individual cabins and gathered in the general store, which was the largest enclosed space in Judith Basin, and which had a cast iron stove big enough to heat a reasonable area around it if everyone stayed close. Mrs. Eugenia Holt had left her small cabin before dark on the first day. She had looked at her firewood supply and her stove and done her own arithmetic and arrived at a conclusion faster than most. She was not a woman who confused stubbornness with wisdom. She had put on every layer she owned and walked 200 yards through the horizontal snow to her neighbor's door and knocked until it opened. The general store filled through the first night. People brought what food they could carry and what wood they had on hand and pressed together in the lamplight and told each other the storm would break by morning. Morning came. The storm did not break. 3 miles north, Constance Hale added 2 pieces of wood to the firebox at sunrise and let the fire settle to coals by mid-morning. The children ate breakfast. Wallace worked on the arithmetic lessons Constance set for him each morning, regardless of weather or circumstance, partly because she believed in the work and partly because she understood that routine is the thing that keeps fear from finding a foothold. Ruth drew at the small table near the south window, where even through the snow-blurred, oiled canvas, there was enough gray light to see by. The stone wall said nothing about the storm outside. That was the quality Constance found hardest to describe even to herself. In the log cabin, you always knew what the weather was doing. The building told you. Wind pressure changed the sound of the gaps. Temperature changes moved through the walls within the hour and registered in the room as a new layer of cold pushing down from the ceiling or up from the floor. The cabin was in constant conversation with the weather, and the conversation was always about the weather winning. The stone hut was not in that conversation. The walls were 2 feet of compressed mass that had spent an entire summer absorbing heat and had been giving it back slowly for 2 months. The cold outside was a fact, but it was a fact that had to travel a very long way before it became a fact inside. By the time the temperature at the exterior surface of the north wall had dropped to 40 below, the interior surface of that same wall was still releasing stored warmth at a rate too slow to measure without instruments, but fast enough to feel with your hand. Constance felt it with her hand often that first day. Not from worry, from something closer to conversation. The way a person checks on something they trust, not because they expect it to fail, but because the checking itself is a form of relationship. The walls were warm, the fire cooled down. The room held itself above 60 degrees. Her breath did not show. The children's hands were not stiff. Ruth complained once about the light being poor for drawing and not once about being cold. Constance banked the coals, added 1 more piece of wood in the afternoon, and let it ride. The second day was worse than the first. The temperature, which had dropped to 20 below by the end of the first night, fell further through the second morning and reached 40 below by afternoon. This was not a temperature that allowed for nuance. At 40 below, exposed skin begins to freeze in under 10 minutes. Metal tools left outside become brittle enough to snap. The moisture in a man's exhaled breath freezes before it disperses, hanging in the air in a brief white cloud before vanishing. The landscape stops being a place where human activity is merely difficult and becomes a place where human activity is simply not viable. Across Judith Basin, the second day produced a particular quality of desperation that the first day had only suggested. Greer's wood supply, which he had assembled with the confidence of a man who believed in preparation, had not been assembled with this storm in mind. No one's had. You cannot prepare for a thing you have not imagined, and no one in Judith Basin had imagined 40 below for 4 days straight. He was burning at nearly double the rate he had planned for because the cold was not behaving the way cold normally behaved. It was not settling. It was not easing in the afternoons the way Montana cold usually did. It was simply present, constantly pushing through every surface with a patience that outlasted everything he could throw against it. He broke apart a chair on the second afternoon. An oak chair his wife had brought from her mother's house in Illinois, one of 3 pieces of furniture that had traveled 2,000 miles to sit in a Montana ranch house, and which carried the particular weight of things carried a long distance for love. He broke it against the edge of the hearth and fed it to the fire piece by piece and watched it burn faster than the wood had, being thinner and producing less heat for the same loss. His wife said nothing when he did it. She was holding the youngest child near the fire, and she watched the chair burn, and she said nothing, which was its own kind of conversation. Pembroke's hay bales had frozen solid against the exterior walls by the end of the first night, which actually improved their insulating quality, slightly frozen hay, being denser than loose hay, but it was a minor advantage against a major deficit. His system of sleeping in shifts was wearing everyone thin. Adults and children both were operating on partial rest, which meant that the cold felt worse than it was, which meant that more fuel went to combat the feeling than the fact. He understood this intellectually and could not stop it practically. At the settlement store, the gathered families had organized themselves with the practical efficiency of people who understand that survival is a collective project. Someone managed the stove. Someone managed the food. Someone kept track of who needed what. Mrs. Holt, who had spent 11 years managing 12 children of varying ages and temperaments in a single room, turned out to be extraordinarily good at this kind of organization. She moved through the crowded store with a focused calm, and she kept the group from the particular social unraveling that happens when frightened people are confined together for too long. But the wood was going faster than anyone had counted. The store's supply, which had seemed substantial before the storm, now looked like a calculation made for a different storm, a reasonable storm, the kind of storm that lasted 2 days and then apologized. This storm did not apologize. On the second night after the children had climbed to the loft and she could hear their breathing settle into the long, slow rhythm of genuine sleep, Constance sat alone in the stone room and was for the first time not entirely certain. It was not fear precisely. Fear has a specific texture, fast and sharp, and aimed at something particular. This was slower and more diffuse, a question without a specific object. She sat in the chair near the firebox where the coals had burned low, giving off a steady orange pulse of heat, and she looked at the walls in the near dark, and she felt the question move through her. What if she had remembered it wrong? Her father had been a careful man, but he had been working in Colorado, which was cold, but not this cold. The thermal mass principles he had taught her were real. She had seen the evidence with her own eyes, 30 years of standing stone in a climate that should have defeated it. But 40 below was a different argument than Colorado cold. 40 below was the kind of cold that rewrote the rules of what stone could do, what thickness could do, what any human structure could do. She sat with the question. She did not try to argue it away or talk herself out of it. She had learned through the specific education of loss and silence that questions do not respond well to being argued away. They only go quiet when they have been genuinely heard. So she heard it. She sat in the near dark of the stone room, with the storm pressing against the walls outside, and she let the doubt be what it was: real, reasonable, and hers. Then she reached out and placed her palm flat against the north wall. The north wall was the one she had cut 3 feet into the hillside, the one with the most earth behind it, the one that faced the direction from which the worst cold always came. If any wall was going to tell her the truth about failure, it was that one. The stone was warm, not the warmth of proximity to the fire. Something deeper than that, a heat stored over months of sunlight and steady burning held in the mass of the stone, the way meaning is held in an old letter, completely without erosion, waiting to be needed. The cold was real. It was out there, all 40 degrees below zero of it, pressing against the exterior surface of this wall with everything it had. And the wall was simply outlasting it, not fighting it, not burning faster to match it, just holding the way her father had said it would hold, the way stone has held through every winter since the first winter. Constance kept her hand on the wall for a long time. She thought about her father's hands on stone, the way he read a rock face, the way other men read a page, running his fingertips across it, slowly feeling for density and fault and grain. She thought about the last summer, the weighted string pressed into her palm, the things he showed her instead of told her. She thought about the house in Colorado that was still standing, that would probably still be standing when her own children were old, that was standing right now in whatever weather Colorado was having, with no one inside it and no fire burning, and the walls simply holding the way walls are supposed to hold when they are built from something true. She thought too about the river, about the ice she had seen, and the words she had not said. She had spent 3 years carrying the weight of that silence. But she understood now, with her hand on the warm stone in the dark, that she had answered that silence, not with words. With this, with every stone hauled up from the creek bed, every mortar joint pressed with care, every decision made and acted on, regardless of what anyone else thought. She had not stayed silent this time. She had built. The doubt did not disappear entirely. It settled. It found its appropriate size, which was smaller than the room, smaller than the walls, smaller than the warmth moving through her palm from 2 feet of stone that had been doing exactly what it was supposed to do. She removed her hand, added 1 piece of wood to the coals, watched the flame catch. Then she went to sleep. The third day brought no relief. If anything, the storm intensified in the morning hours, the wind finding new registers, new ways to press against surfaces and find their weaknesses. Across the basin, the situation in the timber cabins had moved past discomfort into something harder to name. Not quite crisis, but the space just before crisis, the place where people's faces change. And they stop saying the storm will break by morning, because morning has come twice now, and the storm is still there. Greer had burned through his remaining cordwood by midday of the third day. He stood in his lean-to and looked at the empty space where the wood had been, and he calculated with the particular clarity that cold and depletion produce in practical men that he was out of margin. His wife had already begun burning what could be burned: a broken plow handle, a wooden crate, a small pine table from the spare room. These things burned fast and light and gave back less than they took to feed. He stood in his lean-to for a few minutes, which was long enough in that cold to remind him that standing still was not an option. He was a man of 62 years who had spent 40 of them on the frontier, and who had never in those 40 years asked anyone for help with anything he thought he could manage himself. He held this as a point of personal identity. It was not stubbornness exactly. It was more like a covenant with himself about the kind of man he intended to be. He looked north. 3 miles of blizzard, a stone hut that he had called a root cellar in October in front of men who had laughed. A woman who had listened to his opinion with a patience that he understood, now standing in his empty lean-to, was not the patience of someone who agreed. He went inside and told his wife he was going out. She looked at him in a way that carried everything. A long marriage carries every argument and every reconciliation and every morning of ordinary life in between, and she said to be careful. He put on everything he had and went out into the white. The 3 miles north were the longest miles of Greer's life. He followed the fence line where he could find it in the creek bank, where he could not moving by feel through a world that had lost all its landmarks under 4 feet of new snow. He fell twice, got up both times without thinking about it, the way a man gets up when there is no alternative to getting up. His face below the wool wrap he had pulled up to his eyes began to lose sensation by the second mile, which he noted and filed away for later concern. He found the stone hut by the chimney, smoke a thin thread rising from the low roof line and tearing sideways in the wind before it disappeared into the white. He knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Warm air moved over him like a hand. Constance Hale stood in the doorway and looked at him. His face was half frozen. His coat was stiff with ice where his breath had condensed and refrozen. He was standing at the slight forward lean of a man who has been fighting a headwind for an hour and whose body has not yet been told it can stop. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say, "You called this a root cellar." She did not say anything at all. She simply stepped back from the door and made room. Greer came inside. The warmth surrounded him completely. Not the aggressive heat of a fire pushed to its limits, but something more enveloping than that, a warmth distributed through the air and the walls and the floor without gradient or gap. He stood for a moment just inside the door, not moving, just receiving it. Then he moved to the firebox and sat down heavily on the low bench beside it. He reached out after a while and pressed his hand against the wall beside him. The stone gave back a deep, settled heat, the kind that has been accumulating for months rather than hours. The kind you feel not just on the surface of your skin, but slightly beneath it, in the way that genuine warmth reaches places that fire heat never quite manages. He sat with his hand on the wall and said nothing. Above in the loft, Wallace and Ruth slept through the entire visit without waking. The fire burned low and steady. The room held its temperature with the indifference of something that has already made its argument and is waiting for the other party to catch up. No apology was offered. None was asked for. Greer was a man who understood that some reckonings happen in silence, and that silence is sometimes the most honest response available. After a while, Constance gave him something warm to drink. He held the cup in both hands and felt the warmth move from the cup through his palms and up his arms and into his chest. He looked at the walls. He looked at the ceiling, low and sealed, and giving nothing away to the cold above. He looked at the south windows where the oiled canvas filtered the stormlight to a pale amber glow. He stayed for 2 hours. Then he put on his coat and his wrap and his stiff gloves and went back out into the blizzard and fought his way home. When he arrived, his wife looked at him and asked what he had found. He said warmth. She waited for more. He said she was right about the stone. That was all he said. His wife, who had spent 30 years learning to read what was behind what her husband said, understood that a great deal more had happened than those words described. She did not press. She would make her own adjustments in her own time. The storm pressed on through the third night. Constance lay in her bed in the stone room, while the wind found the limits of what it could do against 2 feet of mass, and the answer, as it had been for 3 days and would be for the fourth, was nothing. She could hear the storm. She could hear it clearly. The moan and the crack and the sustained pressure of it, the sound of something trying very hard to break through. She could hear it, and it could not reach her. She thought about her father who had died in a warm room. She thought about what it meant to leave something true behind you, something that outlasted not just the person who built it, but the arguments against it, the skepticism, the practical concerns raised by practical men who had not remembered what she had remembered. The weighted string was hanging on a nail by the door, but worn smooth from 3 generations of hands. She had not needed it since September. The walls were built. The work was done. But she kept it there because some things deserved to stay visible. Outside, the blizzard reached the end of its third night. The temperature was still 40 below. The wind was still constant. But there was something different in the quality of the storm's attention. Something that a person who had spent enough winters in this country could feel even through 2 feet of stone. It was preparing to end. Constance knew it the way her father had known when mortar was cured, not from instruments, but from long familiarity with the thing itself. She rolled onto her side and closed her eyes and let herself for the first time in 4 days sleep without listening. The stone walls held through the night. They had never considered doing otherwise. The morning of the 23rd arrived without drama. No sudden clearing, no theatrical break in the clouds, just a gradual lessening the way pain sometimes eases not all at once, but in increments small enough that you are not certain it is happening until you realize you have not thought about it for an hour. The wind dropped first from a sustained roar to an intermittent push to an occasional gust, and then by mid-morning to something that was merely cold air moving through cold air without particular agenda. The snow stopped. The sky remained the color of old pewter, but it stopped producing anything. The world outside the stone hut's oiled canvas windows went from white motion to white stillness, and in that stillness, the scale of what the storm had done became visible for the first time. Everything was buried. The fence lines were gone, replaced by long, smooth undulations that suggested something beneath without revealing it. The lean-to had collapsed under the snow weight, which Constance had anticipated. She had moved the remaining wood inside on the second day of the storm when she heard the roof joists beginning to protest. The creek had disappeared entirely beneath a surface so uniform and flat it looked architectural. The ridge to the east was a different shape than it had been 4 days ago. The familiar notch filled in the profile altered in the ways that would take weeks of melting to undo. Constance opened the door and stood in the doorway for a long moment. The cold was still profound. Her breath came out in a solid white cloud that hung in the still air, rather than tearing away in wind. The temperature had risen from 40 below to perhaps 20 below, which on any ordinary November day would have been considered severe, but which this morning felt by comparison almost forgiving. She looked at the wood she had moved inside, what had stayed protected under the collapsed lean-to roof, and what she had brought in before it fell. She counted without moving from long habit. 10 logs, perhaps 12. For 4 days of the worst storm anyone in Judith Basin could remember. She went inside and made breakfast. Chet Dolan arrived before noon. He came from the north, which surprised her when she saw him through the window, because there was nothing north of her claim for 30 miles except mountains and wilderness. He was moving slowly, the movement of a man who has been cold for a long time and whose body is operating on the last reserves of something that cannot be replenished by willpower alone. She had the door open before he reached it. He stopped when the warm air reached him, just stopped, one hand raised toward the door that was already open, and stood there for a moment with his eyes closed. The warmth moved over him the way river water moves over stone, finding every surface, settling into every hollow, unhurried and complete. Dolan was a trapper who had been working the northern creek lines when the storm came. He had sheltered in a cave for 3 days, which had kept him alive and not much more. A cave provides protection from wind, but nothing in the way of warmth, and 3 days in a cave at 40 below produces a kind of cold that settles into the bones at a depth that ordinary warmth takes a long time to reach. He had been making his way south toward the settlement when he remembered the stone hut. He had expected, he told her later, to find the worst. Instead, warm air, children's voices from the loft, a firebox with coals burning at the unhurried pace of something that has not been asked to work very hard. He came inside and sat near the firebox and did not speak for several minutes. Constance gave him food and something hot and let him sit in the silence that a man needs after days of cold and fear. Wallace watched him from the corner with the serious eyes of a boy who understood more than he was supposed to. Ruth drew quietly at the table present without being intrusive. When Dolan was warm enough to be curious, he looked at the wood stacked near the door, more of it remaining than he could account for. He asked how much she had burned. Constance told him 10 logs, perhaps a few more. He stood up and moved through the room the way a man moves when he is trying to understand something that does not match what he knows. He pressed his palm to the wall at shoulder height. then lower near the floor, then in the far corner, the northeast corner, the corner that in every structure he had ever sheltered in was where cold gathered first and left last. Each surface offered the same thing. Not dramatic heat, something quieter than that, a deep, even warmth distributed through the stone, without preference for location, the same near the door as near the fire, the same at the floor as at the ceiling. He removed his hand and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Constance. He picked up his gear and thanked her and went back out into the cold, turning south toward the settlement. He had something to tell people. He was not sure they would believe him. He was going to tell them anyway. They did not believe him. Not at first. Dolan arrived at the settlement store in the early afternoon and found 30 people in various states of exhaustion and relief. He told it plainly. The stone hut was warm, genuinely warm, 10 logs for 4 days, walls warm to the touch in every corner. The store was quiet for a moment. Then Greer said, "I know." Everyone looked at him. He said it again quietly, not as a boast and not as a confession, but as a statement of something he had verified personally. "I know. I was there." The room absorbed this. Burl Greer, who had called the stone hut a root cellar, who had watched Constance Hale drag stone up from the creek bed with the certainty of a man watching an expensive mistake, had been to the stone hut in the middle of the worst blizzard in memory and found it warm. The conversations that followed had the quality of recalibration. Pembroke raised the possibility of site-specific factors, the hillside perhaps, or the particular stone. He said it without his previous certainty, more as genuine inquiry than defense. Others nodded. It was easier to believe in exceptional circumstances than in a principle that overturned what they had all been doing for years. Mrs. Holt said nothing. She sat near the stove and looked at the floor and thought about something that kept her quiet for a long time. They came in ones and twos over the following days as the snow compacted enough to allow travel. They came the way people come to see something have been told about and are not sure they believe, with curiosity and skepticism and the slight defensiveness of someone who suspects they are about to learn they were wrong about something important. Constance let them in. She did not explain. She did not lecture. She simply opened the door and stepped back and let people feel what the room felt like. They pressed their hands against the walls. They looked at the corners. They counted the remaining wood. Aldous Whitfield arrived with a thermometer he had kept carefully protected through the storm. He took readings at 3-hour intervals for 2 days inside and outside, simultaneously recording both in a small notebook with the precision of a man who trusts numbers more than impressions. The numbers were not dramatic. They were simply consistent. Outside, the temperature varied between 5 below and 15 above as the weather cleared. Inside the stone hut, the temperature across the same period moved between 63 and 69 degrees, a 6-degree variance across 2 full days. Inside, from corner to center to near the door, the variance was less than 2 degrees. Whitfield compared these to what he had recorded in his own cabin before the storm drove him out. His cabin, well built with a solid fieldstone hearth, had shown interior swings of 30 degrees across a single night, 60 near the hearth, 30 near the far wall. He showed these numbers to Pembroke. Pembroke looked at them for a long time. He asked to see the walls again. Constance let him look. She stood near the door and watched him move through the room with professional attention, examining mortar joints, pressing his thumbnail into them in several places, looking at the ceiling where it met the walls, crouching near the floor along the base of the north wall. No moisture, no soft mortar, no ice crystal patterns from repeated freeze-thaw cycles. The clay and sand mix had cured exactly as described, solid but not brittle, sealed but not airless. He stood and looked at the firebox, its wide-low design, the short chimney, the way it was set into the west wall so heat radiated into the stone mass rather than straight up and away. He turned around. Constance was watching him, neither expectant nor guarded. Pembroke said, "I was wrong. He said it the way a careful man says something he has thought about before, saying slowly with full weight given to each word, not as performance, but as accurate statement. He had been wrong, he said so. Then he put his hat on and went out to examine the exterior walls because there were things about the construction he wanted to understand better. Constance watched him go and felt something quieter than triumph. The satisfaction of a thing completed, not the completion of an argument, but the completion of a structure tested by the exact conditions it was built to withstand and found sufficient. Mrs. Eugenia Holt came on a Wednesday alone without announcing herself. She knocked and waited. Constance opened the door and found her standing straight in the cold, her coat buttoned to the throat, her expression working to arrange itself into neutrality and not entirely succeeding. She came inside. She stood in the center of the room and looked around with the attention of someone revising a judgment in real time, which is uncomfortable work and shows in the face if you are watching. She stayed for half an hour. She asked practical questions about construction, how long it had taken, the mortar composition, the firebox design. Constance answered each directly. Before she left, Mrs. Holt paused at the door. She said, "I called this a fortress once. I meant it as a criticism." She paused. Then she said I was using the wrong tone for the right word. She went out into the hall and Constance stood in the doorway and watched her go and felt something in the territory of things that resolve quietly after a long time of being unresolved. 3 weeks after the blizzard ended, Constance was sorting through the cedar chest at the foot of her bed when she found the letter. She had known it was there. She had put it there herself 6 years ago. When she arrived in Montana and unpacked the few things she had brought from Colorado, it was a small envelope, the paper yellowed and soft from age, sealed with wax, pressed with her father's thumb. Her name on the front in his handwriting, not her married name, her born name. Constance Calloway, the name she had been when she knew him. She had not opened it because she had not been ready. There is a kind of correspondence that can only be received when the recipient has become the right person to receive it. She had understood, without quite articulating it, that she was not yet that person in the years before this winter. She had been surviving. She had been building. She had been becoming. Now she sat on the edge of the bed in the warm stone room and held the envelope and looked at her name in her father's handwriting and understood that she was ready. She opened it carefully, sliding her finger under the wax rather than breaking it. The letter was short. Her father had never been a man of many written words, preferring to show rather than tell. But what was there was complete. He wrote that he was not certain she would ever need what he had taught her. He wrote that he hoped she would not, because needing it would mean life had been hard enough to require it, and he did not wish hardness on her. He wrote that if she did need it, he trusted she would remember correctly, because she had always been the one who remembered correctly. Then he wrote, "The stone does not argue with the cold. It simply outlasts it. This is not stubbornness. This is a different relationship with time. Remember this when they laugh at you, and at some point, Constance, they will laugh. They always laugh at what they have not yet understood. Let them. The stone will still be standing when the laughter has been forgotten." He had signed it with his name, and below his name in smaller letters, the word Cornwall, as if reminding her where the knowledge had originally come from, the long chain of hands it had passed through before reaching hers. Constance read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands. She did not cry, not because she was preventing it, but because what she felt was not grief exactly. It was something more complete than grief, something that included grief the way a landscape includes a single feature, present, significant, but not the whole of what you are seeing. She felt the weight of the years since his death, and the distance from Colorado, and the specific loneliness of carrying knowledge that no one else around you carries. She felt the winter just past, and the warmth of the walls around her, and the sounds of her children moving in the room above. And she felt something else. The river came back to her as it sometimes did the gray-green ice, the loaded wagon, the words she had not said. She had carried that silence for 3 years like a stone of a different kind, the kind that weighs rather than holds. But she understood now what she perhaps had not let herself understand before. She had not stayed silent this winter. She had gathered stone in May and built through the summer and closed the door in November and trusted what she knew. She had acted when acting was possible. She could not undo what had happened on the river, but she had answered it in the only way that remained available, by refusing ever again to leave the important thing unsaid. She stood and walked to the wall near the door where the weighted string hung on its nail. She took the letter and folded it once more and placed it on the small shelf above the two objects together. One that showed and one that told, both saying the same thing across the distance of years. Then she put on her coat and went outside. The community did not change overnight. Communities do not. Change moves through a community the way warmth moves through stone, slowly from the outside in, through mass and contact, in the quiet revolution of what people believe is possible based on what they have seen. But it moved. Greer started in January practically, which was his nature. He hired two men to begin cutting and hauling stone for a bunkhouse on his ranch property. He came to Constance, once hat in hand, and asked two specific questions about wall thickness and mortar ratio. She answered both. He thanked her and left without making anything more of it than that which was its own kind of respect. Whitfield began planning a winter room in February. He came several times with questions, and each time Constance answered what she could and told him honestly what she was uncertain about. He took notes in a small notebook and returned with better questions each time, which she appreciated. A man who asks better questions on each visit has been doing the work between visits. Pembroke came twice in January and once in February, not with questions but with observations. He had been thinking about how the thermal mass principle might translate into methods accessible to families without stonemason knowledge. He and Constance had several long conversations that were the closest thing either of them had experienced to genuine professional exchange, two people with different kinds of knowledge finding where those kinds overlapped. On his third visit, Pembroke brought a young man from the settlement, 18 years old, the son of a homesteader who had arrived the previous spring. He introduced him as someone who was going to build his own place come summer and ought to understand what he was doing before he started. Constance showed the young man the walls and the firebox and the mortar joints, and answered his questions with the patience of someone who understands that knowledge is only useful when it passes from one person to another. She never thought of herself as teaching. She was showing. The distinction mattered to her. Showing left the other person's understanding intact. Her father had shown her. She was showing others. The chain continued. Mrs. Holt came back in late February. They sat at the small table near the south window and they talked for an hour. Underneath the practical conversation, there was something else being exchanged, a recognition between two women who had been underestimated by the same community in different ways and had responded with different kinds of quiet determination. Near the end of the visit, Mrs. Holt said she intended to teach her students something about building materials in the spring. Basic principles. The kind of thing that might change how they thought about what structures could do. Constance said that sounded like a good idea. Mrs. Holt pulled on her coat and said, "Your father would be pleased." Constance looked at her. She had not spoken to anyone in Judith Basin about her father. Mrs. Holt said, "Whitfield told me about the letter. I hope you don't mind." Constance thought about it. Then she said she didn't mind. She watched Mrs. Holt walk back through the February snow, a straight-backed figure moving with the purposefulness of someone who has decided where they are going and adjusted their course accordingly. The stone hut stood through the rest of that winter and through the winter after it and through every winter that followed. Constance Hale raised her son and her daughter in it, and both of them carried for the rest of their lives the specific knowledge of what it felt like to be warm when everyone around them was cold. Wallace grew up to think about material properties with the systematic care that his mother had applied intuitively. Ruth grew up knowing how to look at a hillside and see what it offered rather than what it blocked. The log cabin that Nathaniel had built slowly gave itself back to the Montana weather, which is what wood does eventually when no one is tending the argument. The stone hut required no such tending. It simply stood doing what well-built stone does. Greer's bunkhouse stood. Whitfield's winter room stood. The young man Pembroke had brought that February, built a stone house for his family the following summer, thick-walled and low-roofed, and set into the hillside, and his family burned half the wood his neighbors burned, and slept warm through everything Montana could produce. The knowledge moved through the community the way warmth moves through stone, from contact, without announcement, at its own pace. Constance never wrote any of it down. She did not think of it as a system to be recorded. It was her father's knowledge passed to her through his hands and his words and the weighted string that still hung on the nail by the door, and she passed it on the way he had passed it to her by showing, by answering honestly, by trusting that the person asking the question would do the work of understanding. The last snow of the winter of 1884 fell in April and was gone in 3 days. Constance stood in the doorway of the stone hut on the morning after it melted and looked at the hillside behind her claim, which was beginning to show the first pale suggestions of spring green beneath the retreating white. The ridge to the east was back to its familiar profile. The mountains stood sharp and clear in the cold, bright air. She reached back without looking and pressed her palm flat against the interior wall beside the door. The stone was warm. It held the memory of every fire she had built in it since September. It held the cold it had outlasted and the warmth it had given back, and the 4 days of blizzard it had endured without conceding anything to the storm outside. It held all of this the way stone holds things completely without effort, without the need to announce what it is carrying. Her father's stone house in Colorado was holding the same way right now in whatever weather Colorado was managing this April. 3 decades of winters. No fire burning inside it, no one living in it, just the walls doing what walls do when they are built from something true and given time to prove it. The weighted string turned slowly on its nail in the draft from the open door. Constance looked at the spring hillside for a long time. Then she went inside to make breakfast, and the door closed behind her, and the stone held everything it had ever been given, and the morning came on clear and full of the particular promise that it survives every winter that fails to finish it.